Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm really happy to welcome you, and it's my honor to welcome our two speakers for today, Tom Halliwell, aka Elvis Presley, and Joe Stalder, the father of two kids. It's my honor, so welcome. Hello, Tom. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
Maybe Joe.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Why are we here? You probably all know, but I'm going to say it again. It's actually our last and final week of the PPM Summer Talks, and it's been a 5-week-long conference, kind of done a different way. So we have wonderful speakers and experts who are joining us because they couldn't say no to my emails and me spamming them. So I've dragged them into this idea of a 5-week-long conference instead of having a 2-day-long one. So kind of keeping it, short and sweet and still professional. Today, as I said, we've got Tom and Joe joining us. This is all happening through our PPM workout platform. Feel free to come and join us there if you haven't already done so. It's a wonderful place for everyone to just really keep connecting, keep exchanging ideas, thoughts, anything you've got going on when it comes to your professional life. Personal, feel free as well. And before I give a word to both of our speakers, to Tom and Joe, I would actually like to take a little bit of time to introduce them properly, as we've been doing so. And yeah, so you know what you're into for today's keynote. So let me start with Tom. Tom has over 30 years experience in the pharmaceutical and diagnostic industries. He started his industry career in diagnostics at I'm hoping I'm going to say this correctly, Amersham International. And then Anna again. He has transitioned to pharmaceuticals in 1996 and spent 15 years at Roche in a variety of positions, including Avastin franchise, global project manager, and UK project management group side head. He has joined Norgine in 2011, where he was therapy area director, and in July 2018, he joined Epson as director, global program leader, oncology. He's been responsible for the development and launch of several diagnostic products as project leader, a number of medical products as global project manager, and the successful registration and launch of MuGuard medical device, which actually is a medical device, and hopefully he can tell us more about that as well. If feel free. Tom is a fellow of the Institute of Biomedical Sciences, a member of AMBA, and an executive committee's member of the Pharmaceutical Industry Project Management Group. He's a former chairman. So hello, Tom. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you would like to tell us about yourself that I kind of touched on? Feel free.
They've already mentioned the Elvis connection, so that would be the only additional thing.
Yes. Thank you. I actually, Tom, when we were messaging back and forth, he sent me an email, and at the end of the email, actually, one of them said a quote, and I really, really love that one. So with your permission, if I can, I will read the quote out loud. It's by Russell Lowell, and it says, "The foolish and the dead alone never change their opinions." And I really love that. So I'm just gonna leave it, and please everyone take it as if you like it, leave it if you don't. Next gentleman, we've got Joe Stalder here. He's an effective project manager with broad experience in pharmaceutical development, including preclinical research, clinical development, and commercialization. He specializes particularly in late-stage clinical development, PH2 to NDA. He demonstrated the flexibility in a variety of corporate cultures, from small biotech to big pharma, from startup to mature, and in several therapeutic areas. He's got a strong working knowledge of many project management tools, techniques, and methodologies. He's got a great demonstrated ability to align team to project goals and objectives and work with stakeholders and team members to achieve success. He's also our speaker, and he's been joining us as an attendee as well, but we'll be having him once more again this week. So get ready for him. Joe, hello, welcome, thank you. And if there's anything else you'd like to say, please do so.
Thanks, Katie. I'm coming at you live from a garage in San Francisco, and it's dark here, so I'm just going to leave my camera off for now until the sun comes up. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, Joe. So yeah, that's actually what I'm going to say, and how I'm going to introduce these two lovely gentlemen. I'm really pleased that they're joining us today. We've got a panel discussion on risk management and uncertainty in pandemic times, which is a very hot topic these days still, as we have no idea what's going to happen. And this is why we're here on Zoom, trying to make it all human, even though it's virtual. And without further ado, I'm gonna give word to these lovely professionals and gentlemen. Thank you again so much, and please, this is Tom and Joe.
Okay, I'm sharing my slides, which hopefully you all see.
Yes, we can.
Fabulous.
Yes,
yeah, so it's great to be with you. So we're a small and perfectly formed group, so just feel free to jump in through the chat if there's any questions you have along the way. If not, we can take them all at the end. So as Katie mentioned, we're part of this PPM Summer Talk series. We're coming to the end. There were 3 questions that were posed on the agenda for this slot, and we'll tackle each of those. And of course, any other questions you want to raise, we'll come to. But it's really about seeing early warning signs, talking about tools for risk management, the connection between risk assessment and portfolio decisions. They're the sort of 3 key areas. But before we get into the sort of panel debate discussion, I thought it'd be useful just to run through a few background slides to make sure we're all on the same page with some of the things that have been going on and some definitions. So if we're talking about risk management, we ought to be clear what it is. This is the Pmbok definition, so it must be accurate, of course. But I remember I was at a risk conference about 15 years ago, and David Hilson, who's known as the risk doctor, he gave a very good summary. He sort of summarizes this definition in a memorable way. So he said that risk is uncertainty that matters. And that really stuck with me because he's absolutely right. When you boil this definition down, it really is uncertainty that matters, because a risk is an uncertain event, but it actually matters. It's got to have an effect on whatever it is you're concerned about. And in this case, in terms of projects, it's the project objective. So it's got to have a positive or negative effect on a project objective to be in the end, it had to be a risk. It's got to do something, got to have an impact. So it is an uncertainty that matters. So I think that's a really good definition. And when we're talking about risks in terms of them being uncertain, we're talking about significant stuff, aren't we? We're not talking about trivial things. And it's not that long ago that positives were brought into this definition, because it used to be everyone thinks of risks as negatives, which are obviously threats, but the positives are there are opportunities. If an uncertain event happens, it can go one of 2 ways. It could be, well, I guess it could be 3, because it could have no effect at all, but generally it would have a negative or a positive effect, that uncertain event, if it occurs. And obviously that's another key thing with a risk. It may or may not happen, but it is that threat, if it occurs, becomes an issue. And if it's an opportunity or positive benefit, it does become a benefit in the end. And I think we're all, in terms of risk management, we're all using some sort of risk management process within our organizations, and that really starts with identifying and evaluating the risks, and ideally have some sort of prioritization process within it. And generally most people would use probability of occurrence and impact as the key basis for that prioritization. They may use other things, but generally most people use at least those 2. And obviously then there can be 2 extremes, can't there? There can be the sort of minor impact probability as well, that's low, and you may choose just to ignore it. Or it could be high likelihood of happening and a significant impact, in which case extensive management is going to be needed. there's a lot of people looking at risks all the time, and the World Economic Forum. This is happens to be the report from January 2019, which I pulled up for an obvious reason, because we're talking about risk management and uncertainty in pandemic times. And you can see from this chart that at the sort of red diamond at 3.1 likelihood and 3.6 impact, we can see that the spread of infectious diseases is listed as a risk. And you can see from the right-hand side of the slide that the world is badly underprepared for even a modest biologic threat. Well, we know that to be the case, don't we? Because we've been living through it. So, ultimately, this was all predicted, and we can go back quite some way when it was predicted. A guy called Vaclav Smil, who wrote this book back in 2008. So Vaclav Smil is an emeritus professor in Winnipeg, University of Winnipeg, in Canada, and he's a professor of the environment, basically. And he wrote this book back in 2008, and he was talking about pandemics in that. And he said basically the US has taken no real steps to address a future pandemic, and that's left the US and the world vulnerable to another viral pandemic. Bill Gates obviously has a slightly higher profile than Vaclav Smil, but he reads him. He said, basically, we're not ready for the next pandemic. And as we've just seen, the World Economic Forum has been predicting for years that this sort of event would happen. So if all these people were predicting that this would happen, why were we all caught out by it? And basically, I can't answer it at the country level, but I can answer it at the organizational level. And that's really that our enterprise risk management programs tended to pay attention to those highly visible and more impactful risks than the low likelihood risks like a pandemic. And I might hand it over to Joe here if he wants to sort of bounce off that.
I think there's a theme here that we're going to carry through the rest of the presentation about baseline risks and emerging risks, or risks that are worth, risks that matter. And even in project management in the pharmaceutical industry, there are always risks. There are risks that the drug might fail because of physical chemical properties or biological properties. These are risks that are inherent in our industry, but what are the risks that are relevant or matter? And so that's something that we'll carry through the rest of the conversation, is how do we identify those risks that matter, and how do we identify the warning signs for those risks that matter?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, anybody want to react to that intro in anything?
Yeah, there's actually a question from Greg. Hi, Greg. It's good to see you. He asked, is it not more about also the likelihood of the impact? I'm pretty sure there was two different slides that you were sharing.
I think you've talked to that, Tom. So yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. So no problem.
Yeah, if you've got any additional questions, feel free to. Yeah, exactly as Greg. Feel free to unmute yourself, everyone, and we can kind of make it a discussion.
Okay, well, it's good. I mean, the chat's obviously working, so that's good. I mean, we may, if people put it early in the chat, then we may address it in the next couple of slides. But it's good that just feel free to interact.
Tom, I think that's just on that last slide. COVID. You're right. The world. This was always saying it was going to happen. I guess. Climate change. How are we actively? We know it's happening. We know it's going to impact our facilities, our buildings, the way we work. How are we managing that at the moment? Are we just assuming that our politicians are going to sort it out and that we'll all be okay?
It's a valid question. I mean, looking at the World Economic Forum chart here, you can see that extreme weather events, future of climate change, mitigation and adaptation, natural disasters, they're all up there, aren't they? They're the highest likelihood, highest impact. And so it's a valid question as to what each country is doing. Obviously, there's lots of conferences happening, and we know that lots of countries have their ambitions to bring down their CO2 targets and are putting in flood defenses and all that sort of stuff. So I think there are steps taking place, but it's a very good question as to what is happening at the organizational level to cope with these sort of things. Because if there's a flash flood near somebody's manufacturing plant, what's the backup for that?
Yeah, I know if we're doing a risk assessment on a project in Puerto Rico, we know that the risk of hurricane is high. If we're doing it in Germany, it's not high, but at the moment, risk of flooding in Germany, who would have had, and yet it's repeating problems. So weather impacting our projects, which is I work in the world of capital projects, weather is one of the most disruptive things, and it's looking like it's going to get worse. But are we actually increasing that likelihood?
Yeah, no, that's a very valid question, and it's we do sort of raise those questions at the end because it's looking to the future, and so we'll certainly come back to those questions. But you're absolutely right. These are the serious questions we should be asking ourselves. We clearly missed the ball with COVID, even though it was predicted, because it was relatively low likelihood. People were largely ignoring it. But with these weather events, we know they are happening with increased frequency. Therefore, we should be paying a lot more attention to them, and they should be featuring in discussions.
I guess what we didn't do with the pandemic is it was high likelihood, but we didn't believe that it would happen. We didn't have the evidence. I mean, scientists have been predicting that this is going to happen within the next, the likelihood, if you look at the science, that we were going to have a global pandemic within that period of time was pretty high, but nobody, because it wasn't happening on a regular basis like the weather events, then people ignored it.
Yeah, and I think you can argue about where the World Economic Forum have put it on this chart, because they put it relatively low likelihood, but I would definitely argue with the impact, because I think it's been much more significant than the 3.6 they have on this chart. So again, I think they definitely underestimated the impact that this particular pandemic has had. I guess they were putting it down here as a general pandemic based on previous pandemic impacts, but nevertheless, it's it seems to me that the impact has been much more severe than they put down here.
Thank you. There's also, if I can interrupt you kindly, there's a comment from Dina, and it says, gaining alignment on what is considered a risk is a challenge at times, depending on what the personal agendas are.
That's a very important question. I don't know, Joe, whether you want to comment on that one as well.
It's true. Sometimes we as project managers will flag a risk, and even our team lead or our executive sponsor will downplay the risk because of other things that are going on in the organization. They don't want to highlight a certain risk. It's true, and sometimes we as project managers, it's our job to make these risks known and raise awareness and trust the information or the leaders in what they know to either raise them up, escalate them, or lower them. And sometimes if the leadership is not taking a risk into a certain consideration, I mean, this even goes back to relating this back to COVID. I thought our clinical trials were at risk for certain indications because patients wouldn't be coming into sites as much. And, so I thought there would be a high dropout rate. Some of the leaders in the organization did not think that was going to be a case because, with cancer, people thought cancer was the most important thing in the world. And so, patients would still come in to visits. As it became real, and this comes back to the early warning signs, as it became real and, we experienced dropout rates that were higher than expected, then we started to take action. And so yes, getting alignment is sometimes difficult if there's not agreement, or there's some unknowns that are still pending. I think if you're not getting alignment from the right people, just talking through the organization and raising awareness around, the escalation point. I think that's the way to go. Tom, anything to add on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, for me, it's a lot of, about, relative merits of individual risks, isn't it, and different perceptions on that. And as they get raised throughout the organization through the different levels, inevitably certain risks are chosen and others are not elevated to the next level, and that is going to be based on certain criteria. And every organization will have its own individual way of doing that, and there will be discussions around between different stakeholders at different levels of the organization as to which particular risks should be elevated and which shouldn't, because you can't elevate all of them clearly. But that is certainly where I've seen arguments between teams and more senior stakeholders and organizations around which particular risks should be elevated and why they're more important than other stakeholders might think, and therefore should be elevated and get on a higher level radar. So yeah, I agree that risk, the views of risks are or can be subjectively based, depend on your position and perspective. But nevertheless, if it is an uncertain event that has an impact, if you can quantify that, then you should be able to defend your position, particularly if you can argue that the quality of the data that you have is strong enough that it should be taken more seriously than perhaps people are. So I think that's a good question.
May I ask you a question? We actually kind of moving towards risk tolerance. And for example, like in big companies, risk tolerance is kind of pretty low, and in small companies, it's due to limited resources, it is probably higher. And the question is, how could we measure risk tolerance? Because in my opinion, it seems to be very it's one of central points in risk management, risk tolerance. And second point is about risk mitigation. And for project, and they are very different for projects and portfolios.
Yeah, no, I agree. Joe, do you want to comment on that one just to start with?
And for most of the companies that I've been with, risk tolerance is only identifiable or defined by a measure like budget. Does it have an impact on the budget of this amount, or time, or some kind of quality measure? That's the only way I've seen a risk tolerance be defined. And Vladimir, it's difficult to put accurate numbers on these sometimes because we don't know. We don't know what the impact is going to be on a budget or on a timeline or on a quality measure in advance. Sometimes you only know afterwards. With bigger companies, to your point, they might have a higher risk tolerance because they've experienced many of these things before, and they have a risk register and a lessons learned library that kind of carries them through some of the risks. For smaller companies, you can argue that they could take more risk at an enterprise level because that's all they have. Some companies that have just one asset, they know it's a risky asset, but it's all they have, and so they'll carry it forward with higher risk tolerance. But measuring it, it's difficult. I'm open to hear any other thoughts.
Yeah, and actually, if we started talking about risk tolerance and risk mitigation, what is your opinion about risk mitigation? Because very often, people propose some risk mitigation measures, but they keep forgetting associated risk mitigation with costs of mitigation of these risks, and it could be quite kind of substantial, or it could be small. Who knows how we can align contingency budget with risks and all that stuff. What is your approach on that?
I mean, for me, certainly from we tend to put in we put in place mitigation plans, and you know, you're right, they're not always costed out because it's difficult to get contingency budgets approved a lot of the time. But mitigation plans are certainly part of our risk process. Each risk in our risk register has a mitigation plan attached to it. Not necessarily detailed, but certainly the high level mitigation that would be taken should it arise. But yeah, it's not fully costed out, and you know, you could argue about whether or not you should be doing that, and whether or not you should be getting a contingency budget. But I think every company would have a different view on that, and it's the same, I think, with risk tolerance. I mean, you can see different risk tolerances within the same organization depending on the project. If it's a mature product, people, you know, don't really want to push too aggressively with risk. But if it's a very important project that's, you know, they want to beat a competitor to market, they can be very aggressive and much more willing to take risks within the same organization. Can be a bit schizophrenic, I think, in terms of tolerance to risk within the same organization at times.
Yeah, Tom, you know, I kind of I didn't mean to concentrate to focus our discussion on this topic, but in terms of risk mitigation and corresponding costs, I usually use example of I'd like to show my car to a mechanic every day. Just my car will be completely kind of free of mechanical failures for a very long time, but it will cost me a fortune, and it will not protect me from some drunk driver who will hit me on the intersection. And this is what I'm talking about, because in my opinion, all mitigation measures without costs, they're pointless and useless completely. And the question is just how we need to move ahead with all this stuff. And unfortunately, industry is going in circles.
Yeah,
go on, Joe.
Mitigation can take two forms. You can put aside money in the form of a contingency to say, well, we'll put budget aside if it happens. The other way is to change your planning and change how you're going to approach the project. So, you know, you're going to do surveys before you do stuff, or you're going to find out the information before you progress. So there's different ways of mitigating risk. Contingency is only one.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, certainly in my experience, what you generally find is if you need to mitigate, then you'll certainly get approval generally for those costs. So I don't see it as a big issue because, as we all know, the budget is a dynamic animal, and things don't go according to plan, or pretty rarely. So money will become available, in my experience, if it's needed. So I don't think it's a waste of time.
I would say I strongly disagree. This is one of the weakest points in pharmaceutical, because money is always available. It's not where management will take money. They have to put reserve. Maybe they will put reserve, excessive reserve, in terms of saying 50% of my clinical trial budget will go to contingency, or maybe 10% or 5%. And it's also this assumption. I'm not sure it is kind of quite correct. That money is we will go up and they will find money if needed.
I'm just telling you the reality. The reality in my experience is exactly that. So you may not agree with it, but it's certainly my experience of life in the political industry.
It means that kind of new, there should be some sort of paradigm shift. I spoke several years ago to one of gentlemen from very big pharmaceutical company, and when I expressed my opinion on risk, he said, we don't have this issue. We just include all costs into the project, and we avoid all risks. Several years later, he started. His thinking was different. He was very vocal about risk management and risk assessment, etc., etc. And this is how things are changing. And I hope maybe somebody will kind of continue this discussion offline to get right answers.
A good way is looking at some of the at-risk software, which will. No. Greg, with all due respect, at-risk software is dealing with mostly quantitative aspects of risks, and it means that when you have a product, just one product, I make it simple. When you have a product, you can calculate how long it would take to develop this product, put probability distribution, the same about sales volume, etc., etc. And they come up with very good estimation what with all these probabilities, beautiful graphs, etc., etc., etc. But in clinical trials, for example, situation is very different. We cannot make assessment of future revenues, even if we discount them for the future, because there are so many other factors, manufacturing, sales, etc., which could affect outcome of our impact of clinical trial on the future product. Therefore, we have to stay not with kind of at risk, and we have to kind of move probably methodology which could be suitable for the industry. And current situation is we just make risk assessments, and then we jump into risk-based monitoring without risk mitigation planning, effective risk mitigation planning.
Okay, now let's some interesting points there, and I think time is slipping away, so it'd be useful to at least move on to some of these other points that we wanted to talk about. So early warning signs was something that is an interesting thing to think about. So is there any experience of what early warning signs might look like to raise people's awareness that something's not quite right with a project? Well, there's certainly been quite a bit of research. This is just one paper I pulled out where they conducted a lot of post-mortems on failed projects, and they clearly pulled out a top 12 of the most likely warning signs that you're going to come across. Half of them are people related, half are process related, and I don't know whether that comes as a surprise to anybody, but that's, it didn't come as a real surprise to me. I don't know, Joe, whether you want to react to that finding.
Yeah, it feels right, just in my experience, half people related, half process related, because the people part comes with experience, and experience is what allows people to anticipate risks. So this isn't really a surprise to me, like you say, but in my practice too, as you get better at something, you get more experience and you develop your, I keep saying the lessons learned library, then you're able to anticipate risk better and deal with them better. The process part, that's something, it's always a challenge in the pharmaceutical industry to manipulate the process to be able to do things better. So I don't know, I agree with this half and half.
Yeah, no, I it's with my experience as well. And technical issues came out very low on the list, which again is not all that surprising to me based on my experience. And I guess, there are lots of project assessments that happen throughout the lives of projects. We can think of the regular reviews that go on, governance reviews, at the end of project reviews where we look for lessons learned, lots of different reviews. but I don't see that many companies conducting project health checks regularly, in my experience, which I think, based on success of projects, might be worth certainly as challenging ourselves within our organizations as to whether we should be considering doing more regular project health checks, maybe using external people to do that, because as we know, things are not always raised when perhaps they should be. And in my experience, when you use externals to do health checks on projects, they're able to tease out things that internally are quite difficult to pull out. And I know, when you're doing interviews with people yourself, you can often pick up body language cues that something is not quite right. And obviously, often the culture within organizations does suppress people saying what they think about risks. And obviously, things like surveys and whistleblowing procedures can help to flush those things out. I don't know what people's reaction is to that.
I want to take this back to the pandemic and relate. We not to make this political, but there were early warning signs when there were news releases from China that there was an outbreak, and it started with 10 people, 20 people, 100 people, and then deaths started to occur. And so there were early warning signs, and the global reaction to that, I thought, was fairly slow. And especially in the United States, I can only speak to the US, but flights to and from China were still allowed, and there was a lot of travel that did not really lock down the situation. So those early warning signs were available, and if there were a proper kind of health check there to see, okay, what's the situation, what's the impact, what can we do about it, there might have been opportunities to mitigate the situation a little bit more.
Yep. The next section, if nobody has any more questions on that, on the early warning sign front, we can move on to tools. So
yeah, sorry, there's actually just one comment from Dina, and it says, she says, one challenge due to the pandemic is the virtual environment difficult for non-verbal cues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think non-verbal cues are much more difficult to pick up in a virtual environment. I mean, you can pick up some extreme ones by people's facial expressions, but some of the other stuff is much more difficult. People's general posture and the way they, whether they're doing things with their hands that usually gives away that they're not comfortable, that sort of stuff is very, very difficult to pick up virtually. And I think that's, for some of these project reviews, there's no substitute for face-to-face time on some of these things, which has obviously made it very difficult in COVID times when people have been working from home. But I think as we hopefully begin to migrate to a more of a hybrid model, then I think direct face-to-face contact is going to pick these things up again as it did in the past.
One warning I've seen when doing risk assessments is if the project lead wants to restrict the number of people you want to talk to and doesn't give you access to the people who are working on the project, that's a sure sign that there is something to hide in terms of risk.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's something to watch. I mean, I know from in my experience of doing this, it's best to do this as more of a in a sense, take it out from the project team directly and have have this done to ideally all the projects at the same time, and have somebody coordinate that from outside, so that you avoid those things, because they then know, they'll get hold of the team lists, they'll get hold of the key stakeholders, and therefore it's much more difficult to prevent those useful discussions with people that maybe project leads don't want you to speak to. But I agree, so that is a tricky one if you're being restricted, if you're just looking at one project and the project lead is controlling access. That's not the ideal situation. Tools. So I guess we've all got our own risk management process, which might look something like what's on here. And we all probably use some sort of risk impact matrix, which may be a 3x3, 4x4, 5x5, etc., depending how complex we want to make it. But there's a lot of tools and techniques out there to help us with risk management, including tons and tons of software tools. Joe, I don't know whether you want to pull out any of these that you find particularly useful to supplement the regular risk management process that you from your experience.
Yeah, I think the one you highlighted, the probability impact matrix, that's my favorite. It's a nice way to visualize what you need to take action on versus which ones you need to monitor and kind of keep in mind. I like having a good risk register and keeping it simple. Anyone who attended my talk earlier in the conference saw that a very simple risk register that relates back to your goals is just such a useful tool to share the context, share the risk, raise awareness, and keep it documented.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I think a lot of these can be useful in different contexts. I know for me, in corporate projects, I've tended to use techniques that I don't generally use in regular mainstream project work. So that the pestle analysis, for example, I've used in corporate projects because it forces you to look at categories that maybe you wouldn't normally look at. And I think it's helpful to have frameworks that force you to look at different categories of risk that maybe you wouldn't generally think of. Obviously, brainstorming can do that as well if you bring in the right people from different parts of the organization as part of that risk identification process, where you just get people together, and obviously there's interesting stuff can come out of those brainstorming sessions in my experience. Anybody else want to react to any of these? Think that some of these are useless, some of these are helpful?
We tend to use certainly on cost and risk schedule assessments, cost assessment, a P50, P100 approach, where you generate for the schedule a best and worst case. The likelihood of the best case is P0 and the worst case is P100, and decide where we want to be.
Right.
And we often find that the schedule that's put together has no contingency whatsoever on it, so it's a P0. And we find that quite useful to say to management, do you want to go ahead on a project that the specialist using his software has said has got zero chance, or do we want to put a contingency in, and how much do you want to put in? And they give him the dates. And that's very powerful, because that's not just saying that they somehow can get their head around that contingency. And we do the same with our scheduling. In J&J, we come up with a contingency and we always go P50. So we're saying, and we say that means you got a 50-50 chance of hitting your project at a P50. So 50, we expect half our projects to go over, but half to come under. So that's just the approach we take.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting idea. I think I've used something pretty similar to that, where we would tend to call it slightly different language, but it would be more or less, a very aggressive plan, a more realistic plan, and more of a pessimistic plan. So, and generally, you try and get support for the realistic plan, which would clearly include a level of contingency, but at least it's a plan that then gets accepted. Whereas, you know, if you're forced in the end to an aggressive plan that you know has got zero float in it at all, then you're already on a hiding to nothing, aren't you? And the risk of not achieving it is very, very high indeed.
We tend to just make it plain from the beginning, the percentage chance, and then, you know, highlight the fact that management wanted to go with that. And then if it goes over, it goes over. You know, it's not the project managers. The project manager will give advice on where it should be. And it's down to the stakeholder to say, or the sponsor to say, no, I'm going with that aggressive plan.
I'd like to add a couple things. All these tools are could be applied for the project management, right? And but unfortunately, I could not find anything related to the portfolio risk. I'm talking about not financial portfolio of projects. And does anybody have experience to apply these tools or something else to evaluate to the portfolio risk evaluation?
Well, I mean, certainly from my experience, the way it generally works is that the projects feed into the portfolio discussion. So you're using the individual project risk assessments as part of your portfolio discussion.
No, unfortunately, it's not. They are not equal. All projects could be. There was. I'm sorry. I'm too old for for this, and I remember papers how to build reliable system from unreliable elements. This paper was written one of kind of fathers of modern information theory. And this paper indicated that even each project may not be perfect, but risk of the kind of set or portfolio could be good enough, because I do believe that there is no perfect projects at all in our life. Each project, especially the more complicated one, they have a lot of kind of issues, a lot of risks, etc., etc. And it means that we cannot kind of scale risk of each project to the portfolio level. There are different techniques and different methods to do it, especially if we decide to include risk mitigation at the portfolio level.
There's no substitute. You mentioned it for experience. And at a portfolio level, when we're looking at forecasting the portfolio spend for the year, in J&J, we know we nearly always miss it on the portfolio's annual spend. So we risk adjust it and say, well, okay, we've got all the figures in from the project managers on their forecast for all their projects. We're going to assume it's going to be 90% of that. And if we're going over that, we can adjust it halfway through the year. We do a June update and a November update to see where we're tracking, and we can slow down or speed up projects to hit that. That's the only kind of portfolio level management of risk that we tend to do on the projects that I work on in J&J.
Yeah, but annual planning is kind of much more simplistic because than others, because a lot of projects in pharmaceuticals, they are multi-year projects. And therefore, risk management at the portfolio level should be done on say 5 years time interval, 10 years, depending on nature of these projects and nature of this portfolio. Because for example, like for some reason, management decided to select very risky projects in the portfolio. But what to do with them if they say, oh, okay, this is just cure for Alzheimer? let's move, let's jump to this and put all our resources into these projects, to this kind of drug development program, etc., etc. And there should be kind of right balance to make sure that portfolio risk is not high enough, and how to mitigate it, to kind of to use some extension, something to make sure that that we will still have cash flow to allocate some resources to develop this very attractive drug, etc.
Yeah, I guess if you've got to do some kind of risk profile for every project, and then you roll that up at the portfolio level. And if that looks like your portfolio is a high risk portfolio, then you've got to make some adjustments to have every project on your portfolio as a high risk. But to do that, you've got to do some kind of evaluation.
Of course, I made some sort of little bit artificial example. But in general, when we say make adjustments, let's go to, we need to have certain rules, certain tools which could predict portfolio risk, not based on project risk. But of course, project risk is very important. And by the way, how it could be calculated, it's also another question to ask. Because again, it's and what to do with portfolio risk? It's still question is not answered.
I think it is answered. I think I don't tend to agree with that. I think, you know, clearly the portfolio is a combination of the risks of all the projects in the portfolio. So, you know, every company has an appetite for risk, and they balance it out. Some, you know, they have a mixture of different risk profiles for the projects in their portfolio. And I think they can measure that. And that's certainly my experience. So I don't think it's that broken.
But the question is how?
How?
Yeah,
well,
I have a similar experience with you, Tom. It's you know, using the PTS and PRS from each project, each indication, and that rolls up into the portfolio risk assessment. And that gives the ability for the organization to give kind of a, you know, a budget haircut at the end of the budget year. So I do see this pretty commonly across organizations, to roll up the project risks into the portfolio, and there then you have your portfolio risk.
And you have to weight them in the portfolio, because a small project which is high risk isn't a big portfolio risk.
Yeah.
But a big project.
In my just about PTRS so far, except kind of couple companies, PTRS is estimated at the therapeutic area level, and it means that, for example, if medium-sized company has two therapeutic areas, two therapeutic areas represented in their portfolio, there might be not not accurate enough to kind of calculate everything based on the same set of probabilities of success.
Yeah, we do our PTRS at the indication level, not necessarily the therapeutic area, and that allows us to calculate the estimated revenue stream. And so, you know, each indication has its own revenue stream that's estimated by the commercial team, and then we do the PTS and PRS based on that indication. So those then roll up. That's what we define as the project. Does that resonate with anyone else at J&J? Yeah. Greg, how do you guys do it?
Yeah,
I don't really get involved in that type of risk assessments, because we're more about facility based. So it's more about traditional sort of cost schedule type risks and capital planning risks than sort of the level that you're talking to. So there will be people working at that level, but it's not an area I'm involved with.
Joe, how did you do it at the indication level? What kind of rules are there? Because what is that? Is it are there some tools, or just people vote on what would be probability of phase 2 of drug A? How it works? How does it work?
Yeah, it's very subjective. You know, there's a little bit of science and a little bit of art to creating your PTS and PRS estimates, but it's really the point of it is not necessarily the number, but it's the culmination of all the risk adjustments that you make across the portfolio. That's the value of doing a PTS and PRS. Even if you're wrong on one project, and you know, you might estimate an 80% PTS and it turns out to be 75. On another project, you might be estimating 60 and it turns out to be 65. So it balances out throughout the portfolio if you have a big enough portfolio.
Yeah, I wish it would be 60 versus 65. Maybe it would be 60 versus 90 or something else. And it happened very often, and it's not consistent. And finally, when people estimated probabilities at the indication level, they could say, oh, okay, it looks like this indication has higher probability of or likelihood of success, but we do believe that this indication has lower likelihood of success than indication B, which we calculate this way. It creates a lot of kind of uncertainties and subjectivism.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's not an exact science, is it? It's not an exact science, but the reality is, I mean, people try and do the best that they can. I mean, there's a lot of benchmarking data that people generally use, which, you know, is the best that's available. It may not be 100% accurate, but what is these days? But I think there is lots of, you know, people try their best to get accurate data, and obviously there's a level of uncertainty in making these decisions. But the quality of the data is critical to what we're doing here. It's absolutely critical. So people try and get the best data they can get their hands on, but inevitably it's not always as accurate as we would like it.
It's recognizing it's both an art and a science, as somebody said. I think that's important, but doing it, you know, actually do a risk assessment and actually pull it together.
Yeah.
Don't just throw, you know, numbers or whatever at something or rough percentages. Do some kind of assessment to back that up where you can.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think what we've been discussing pretty much fits with this particular slide, actually. That, you know, there's a lot of you know, analysis goes on at the portfolio level, and you know, there is a lot of intimacy in governance and project assessments, but ultimately, if we can't pick up those early warning signs, then the whole thing isn't operating properly. Bottom line, you know, we need to be able to pick up those early warning signals and get as accurate a risk assessment process in place as we can. You know, inevitably, it's very easy to criticize what is already in place. But I think the bottom comment on this slide is unfortunately does happen quite a bit in my experience, is that there tends to be over optimistic assessment of benefits and underestimates of problems, particularly when project teams are presenting, which can make the process suboptimal, in my view. Joe, I don't know, you want to add anything to that?
No, Tom, but you know, I really appreciate the conversation from everyone who participated, and I took away a lot from this session. So I appreciate, Katie, you know, you putting this together and giving us time.
Yeah, thank you. There's actually there are actually two questions, but I'm thinking that because we're running past 5, if I actually put them and posted them online on our PPM workout platform, maybe people can actually start having a discussion. There are actually 2 questions, and I can actually see that some people has started leaving the webinar, and I know this is a few minutes past 5. So if we would actually do that, so I'll take with the permission of everyone here, I'll close it off here, and I'll post the questions from Peter. They're here in the chat, and feel free, anyone, put down the view of, you know, towards the questions, and see if there's anything that you would like to add to that, and it'll be found at the PPM workout platform. So I think if you'd like to say, Joe or Tom, any last words before we wrap this up?
Well, it's been great to have a very interactive discussion. Good.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not sure if Joe, yeah, I think actually he added, yeah, I don't want to keep him up any longer. He had a hard day, but yeah, thank you everyone. I'll say I'm just going to wrap it up here. This was really, really wonderful. And I love the participation, and hopefully Tom and Joe enjoy that as well as the speakers and presenters. And please keep joining us. We still got 2 wonderful days with Joe, actually, both of them with Joe. Joining us, so it's gonna be wonderful. It's gonna be all right. Please keep joining us. This is being recorded, and I will be posting it online on our uploading it to our YouTube channel. So thank you again so much. I'm gonna leave you all with you know, with whatever you actually wanted to take from this session, because there has been a lot said, and I cannot wait to see you all tomorrow and Friday for the last 2 webinars. So thank you again so much on behalf of Y Summit and everyone else here. And thank you, Tom and Joe, for participating. It's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you. Have a
Bye-bye.
lovely day.